Part 2 of the first sign, we're going to look at the water to wine miracle. Chapter 2, verse 1. On the third day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. So this could refer to this third day. It could be the third day of the week, which would be Tuesday. Tuesday's the third day of creation. And that's the day where God said it was good twice. So got that on the screen there. In verse 10, God saw that it was good. And then in verse 12, God saw that it was good. So he says it twice. And it's interesting, he doesn't say it was good at all on Monday. So we've got the day of the double blessing is Tuesday. And then some speculate that weddings were held on Tuesday, but this is very much disputed. Weddings tended to be held on Wednesdays, actually. So much for that theory. It could mean also that simply 3 days had elapsed since the discussion with Nathaniel in chapter 1. There's a literary device called inclusio where you use the same term to begin and end a passage. So in John 2 verse 19, Jesus says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. And that could be bracketing this passage in verse 1 on the third day there. So John is not necessarily chronological. And so while in our minds, John chapter 2 occurs when Jesus is still relatively obscure, it is possible that this wedding had occurred after Jesus and his disciples had gained some regional notoriety and would be honored guests. And so that could be happening here. We just don't know. In any case, John is very clear that this is still very much a private miracle during his where he hasn't really publicly revealed himself as Messiah just yet. So this wedding takes place in Cana, and we've actually got two contenders for where this miracle took place. One is up here, kind of off the beaten path, and then the other is down here, and it just so happens to be on the road between Nazareth and Tiberias, so makes it a lot easier for the tour buses to say that that this is the Cana. Because what will happen is here's where we talk about Elijah and his showdown with the priests of Baal, and then Megiddo is down here, and then we head over to Nazareth and then up to Tiberias for the Sea of Galilee sites. So very convenient for buses, but most scholars would say it's probably the northern site is the more accurate one. We'll be back in Cana when we get to John chapter 4. We tend to think of a rabbi or a pastor or a priest as officiating a wedding. That's probably not what was happening in that day. Lancaster reports that the Jewish sages were invited to actually to liven things up. So they would tell stories and they would kind of be the life of the party, which is kind of interesting. Sometimes today, people can't wait for the pastor to leave so that the real party can get started. But it's actually the opposite in that day, apparently. The Talmud records that the disciples of Hillel, one of the prominent rabbis in that day, would sing before the bride and add joy in other festive ways. So I kind of find this fascinating because is there another wedding at some point in our future where Jesus will provide over, where he will add joy, and you emphatically say yes? We read about that in Revelation 19, and there's all of the various wedding feast references in the New Testament that talk about the banquet, and so all of that is really this event here in Cana is foreshadowing the great wedding feast to come. And in any case, Jesus is definitely about to liven things up at this wedding in Cana. Verse 3, when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. And Jesus said to her, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. And you get the feeling we're maybe missing something in our English translation. So let's take a look at what might be going on here. Here's a picture of some clay wedding jars that would have been used to store wine at such a wedding feast. So just as it is today, if a host ran out of food or drink at a wedding, it would be just a major social faux pas. First century Jewish celebrations typically lasted for 7 days, and the host was responsible for providing this quantity of wine to his invited and any uninvited guests too. And so there's a potential here that maybe they miscalculated here. And anyway, this would just been a major source of embarrassment. John Lightfoot, a commentator from a few years back, believes that Mary might have had a formal role in the planning of the feast and was not merely being a busybody here. So again, we aren't told that, but it's just something that we have to infer. Now, as I said earlier, the Messianic age is often depicted as a wedding banquet with free-flowing wine. In Numbers, Rabbah, which is a type of commentary, the Holy One, blessed be he, will make a banquet for the righteous in the Garden of Eden. He will give them to drink wine preserved in its grapes since the 6 days of creation. So it appears, the question is, was Mary asking, knowing who Jesus was, with all of the enunciations that we looked at previously, was she asking for the inauguration of the Messianic age here to be, brought forth with wine, because that will be a symbol of the Messiah? And perhaps this is why Jesus replies as he does. So we don't know, but that's a good guess. As I mentioned in part 1, we're separated by 2,000 years of history and several thousand miles of geography and different languages. So we read this, how this comes to us in English. It sounds cold and kind of off-putting, but in any case, I don't think Jesus would have disobeyed the commandment to honor his father and mother. And from the context, it doesn't look like Mary took any offense at Jesus' remark at all. Stern speculates that Jesus might have been attempting to curtail Mary's pride as the mother of the Messiah. So just as the people wanted a political Messiah, maybe Mary forgot about the prophecy that Jesus would pierce her heart, would be a sword to pierce her heart. And so she was hoping for the celebration Messiah, bringing in the Messianic age. So in any case, Jesus would address the literal problem Mary brought to him, but would not do so in the public way that she might have hoped he would have, which is why he says, my time has not yet come. The film series The Chosen takes an interesting angle on this. Basically, Mary is not looking for personal glory at all, but is merely trying to save her friend the public shame of running out of wine at a banquet, and that's very, very real concern in that day. So instead of Jesus' reply being curt or disrespectful, his response back to her is more inquisitive. And you can see the screenshot. Why are you telling me this? And then he reiterates that it's not time for a public sign, to which is interesting. They add, Mary looks up at Jesus and says, please, do something to save the embarrassment. And then Jesus, being Jesus, he figures out a way to honor his mother, but have the sign be kept quiet. What I like about this and things like this, when we kind of take a view that challenges the common narrative that Jesus was being rude, I think it gives us another way to look at the story. And as long as that way is still faithful to the Bible, we can be comfortable holding a multiple options as to what might be going on here. There's nothing wrong with that. We always need to make sure that any paraphrase lines up with Scripture, as this series tries to do. But God did give us the gift of imagination. So where the Bible doesn't give us every little detail, throughout history, people have filled in gaps, and there's a type of Jewish commentary called the Targum, which is basically a paraphrase, and it adds in stuff that's not in the text, just to kind of make it more interesting. And so I think there's a time and place for this. We just need to be clear when we're speculating, but I think it's good to have the common narrative challenged, which is one thing we'll try to do as we work through this series. And then Mary says, do whatever he tells you. She says that to the servants. So wine continues to be very popular at wedding celebrations. And again, we'll have the free-flowing wine in the Messianic age. So Lancaster's paraphrase of this would be Mary saying, they have no more wine. I know you are the promised Messiah who is supposed to bring the endless supply of wine. So how about bringing some now? And then Jesus says, what can I do about it now? The Messianic era, where the supply of wine will be endless, has not yet come. And then Mary, in faith, says, knows some things that will happen anyway, even though it's not what she wants. He says, do whatever he tells you. So even though it wasn't his time, the wedding feast at Cana provides prophetic anticipation to the ultimate wedding feast, which is the marriage supper of the Lamb. And so that's the one thing we need to take from it, is Jesus will have wine flowing abundantly at the wedding supper. Verse 6, now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Judaoids' rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. So here we've got Judaioi used in an interesting way. It doesn't refer to the people, but a type of religious procedure. And this is another suggestion that John is explaining the situation for non-Jewish readers, but ones who were still loosely familiar with rites of purification. John doesn't need to go into detail about the reason for the purification, but he just says that this is the Jewish way of doing things. That's what these jars were for. Jesus will make it clear in chapter 4 that the Jewish method is the correct interpretation. So he kind of corrects the Samaritans here, because when in this exchange with the Samaritan woman, he will say salvation is of the Jews. This does tell us a couple of things about Judaioi, because we mentioned that generally English translations will be the Jews when we see this word Judaioi, but Judaioi were not necessarily limited to the geographic territory of Judea. We're in Galilee here. This is not Jerusalem, and yet there's a reference to Judaioi. Not every reference to the Judaioi is referring to the temple establishment. This could be followers of the Jewish system. So kind of going back to what I said in the beginning of part 1, we need to always check on how this word, the Judaioi, is used, and that will help our understanding of what's going on here. If the audience were Jews, as in Matthew's gospel, this qualifier would have been entirely unnecessary. So the fact that John mentions it, he apparently expects his audience to be familiar with purification rituals, but not necessarily Jewish purification rituals. So it's kind of interesting tidbits when you kind of dissect what may be happening here. John gives us a lot of detail about these stone water jars. He says there were 6 of them. They each held 20 or 30 gallons to be an English equivalent, and he mentions that they were stone. Stone, we know, resisted ritual impurities more than clay did, so that's why the pots would have been made of stone. As to why there are 6 and why is he telling us the size, other than just to say that the volume was tremendous, much bigger than the jar in this picture, by the way. Probably almost as big as wine barrels are today. So this just would have been a lot of wine. John doesn't use details like this by accident, so there's probably some significance. We just don't know what it is. This is the first of 7 miracles in John's gospel. So John is testifying that he was an eyewitness that creation submitted to Jesus' authority. A couple of details about the master of the feast. It's interesting. This master was tasked with controlling the flow of food and drink, and so he would have been responsible for running out of wine prematurely. So this was kind of on him, and Jesus really did him the biggest favor here, in addition to the embarrassment of the parents of the groom. The master also pronounced the blessings over the food and the wine. The blessing of the first cup was called the Kos Hasbasora, the cup of the good news. And so kind of let that sink in. What do Christians call the gospel? Good news. And the good news in this case was the certification of the bride's purity. And so think about that in relation to the ultimate wedding feast, where Jesus will be the officiator over this banquet, and his bride will be gathered around him. So that's kind of neat to think about. When the master of the feast tasted the water now became wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who drew the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine, but you have kept the good wine now." So obviously the reason for that is pretty self-evident. People become tipsy, and you can bring out the box wine instead of the nice vintage there. So although the story is very familiar to us, John tells us that it was a very private miracle, and that's kind of the point here. Keener notes in his background that drunkenness is unlikely at these types of celebrations. They often diluted the wine 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. They would be, feeling good, but the drunkenness and kind of out of control would not have been acceptable in this type of setting. John concludes this is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. That's the key verse for us. After this, Jesus went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. So note that the lesson began with Andrew proclaiming Jesus as the one Moses spoke of, and then the passage kind of ends, even though it's the middle of our chapter, the passage ends with this miracle of water to wine. So the one Moses spoke of, Moses' first miracle was turning the water to blood, the first major miracle. Jesus' first major miracle was turning the water to wine. So this is unlikely to be a coincidence. There's definitely a connection here, linking Jesus back to the one as the one Moses spoke about. And so our memory verse right at the end here, John 2, verse 11, this is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory. Again, remember, John is the witness. His disciples believed in him, and that's the part we want to remember. So John gives us the reason for the miracle here, and that's so that his disciples might believe in him. Stern says the reason for the miracle is to anchor the trust of his new Talmudim, his new disciples, in the glory of God as manifested through Yeshua, our Messiah. And that's pretty neat. As we mentioned, feasts in those days lasted 7 days, not just one day, and then the master of ceremonies would have pronounced a blessing each day over the bride and groom over a cup of wine each day. So very important. Wine is not just an ancillary, walk up to the bar and get a glass, but very much part of the ceremony and a key point. And so the wedding would have been ruined without Jesus' miracle. In the beginning, though, we asked what this miracle means for us. And the answer is that it foreshadows the marriage supper of the Lamb. And Daniel Lancaster has a great quote here. The disciples and guests present at the wedding interpreted the transformation of water to wine as an important sign towards the Messianic era when wine will flow in abundance, and the Messiah is the toastmaster, the master of ceremonies there. In that day, there will be a great wedding banquet, and Yeshua, Jesus himself, will be the way, the truth, and the life of the party, proclaiming the wedding blessings over his bride. And that's from Lancaster. So we look forward to our great Messianic wedding where wine will flow in abundance and Jesus will proclaim blessings over us. And until that day, if the Lord tarries, we'll see you next time where we will be in Jerusalem for Jesus' first Passover with his disciples and that very unique meeting with a guy by the name of Nicodemus. So we'll see you next time.
We hope you've enjoyed this lesson. For more information, find us on the web, www.talmudimway.org.